You made it to the Go Commando Show with Fred Galvin. On our new mission, we contend with the naked truths of health, leadership, and overcoming adversity. Now it's time to Go Commando. Hey Commandos, we have a great show for you today. And the gentleman that is our guest was a Marine that served with me when I was a young infantry platoon commander out on the West Coast. He was an infantryman, and now have the distinct pleasure of announcing that he is running for the U.S. Congress. And it is his goal to represent the people in the 4th District of South Carolina, where Congressman Trey Gowdy currently represents that district and is moving on to other things. And so this spring he has announced, and he's coming out fighting to win the Republican nomination to become, hopefully, move from being a candidate to a member of Congress in this November's election. And he will, hopefully this time next year, be representing South Carolina in that election. So welcome to the Go Commando Show, Barry Bell.
Thank you, Major Galvin. How are you doing?
Very good. Thank you. And I want to let the listeners know a little bit about, my experience. And because I know you're a humble man, you're not going to talk about yourself. And that kind of leads to a boring conversation. And as a member of Congress or as a candidate for being in the U.S. Congress, you're often not going to talk a little bit about yourself. So let me tell the listeners a little bit about the man that I remember is a very young. I had just showed up at the battalion, and you had came off of a deployment. You were already there, successfully completed a overseas deployment on ships to the Pacific and the Middle East. And as this story goes, you were ready for more. You're going back for another deployment with us, and you had an interesting background before you joined the Marine Corps, which I'm going to get into just in a second. But when we were together in that same platoon, that was known as a lot of times people are very fond of those early years, but as a young infantry platoon commander, I looked for young, aggressive American men that were ready to fight and had strong morals, ethics, and demonstrated courage and integrity. And that's what you had demonstrated the entire time we were together in 1st Platoon, Charlie Company, 1st Light Armor Reconnaissance Battalion. So now those of you who don't know, who have not served in the military, at that particular time in the mid-90s, we looked for the very best that would select for the U.S. Infantry, Marine Corps Infantry, and those that had the highest test scores, what we call the GT test scores, they would be selected from amongst the infantry candidates to become we called light armored vehicle crewmen. So they had to have a above average intellect, and then they were sent to an additional school beyond the School of Infantry to specifically understand how to drive, how to use the guns, and how to use the communication gear, and how to maintain a vehicle that, we did put some restrictions on there, but it can travel over 100 miles an hour. It has 8 wheels. It's can cross rivers and lakes. It is a very highly capable, similar to the Army, which copied it with their Stryker vehicles, but this is a light armored vehicle. It has thermal sights, a 25 millimeter chain gun that goes out to almost 3 kilometers, fires 2 different types of rounds, armor piercing and high explosives. And here's a young man, not long after high school, he answers his country's call, not because of the excitement or the rush, because there's an attack on America. This was before all that. He felt compelled, and he's going to tell a little bit about his story growing up of what led him to the Marine Corps. But I wanted to personally let you know, and I'm going to tell a couple more stories, that this gentleman did not follow the normal career path for a congressman, which many, many, many congressmen or women go straight from college to a professional degree, like a law degree. And there's nothing criminal or wrong in doing anything like that, but they have a very carefully, combed career path, and it's very cautious and often guided by individuals that are going to help and assist. And that's oftentimes how our system is, where we have some gridlock, because people don't want to do anything because they're representing the interests of others instead of the people of the United States. So that's why I wanted to interview a gentleman who I personally served with. He was a young enlisted Marine. So when he was a teenager, right after high school, he raised his right hand and he answered our country's call not to only serve, and not just to serve in the Marine Corps, but to serve in the Marine Infantry in a deployable unit, which he did, and he deployed multiple times. And his second deployment, where I was his platoon commander, we were actually given an emergency notification. We deployed early on what we thought would be another Desert Storm 2. So we deployed about a month early. And that kind of stress normally gets under people's minds. What I sensed of Barry Bell was a sense of hunger and anticipation that he's going to actually get the chance to do what he was trained to do as a gunner, a 25 millimeter gunner, and also firing a medium machine gun, firing 7.62 millimeter. He looked forward with excitement and anticipation. And we did a lot of things during that workup, not just on our vehicles, but to test the courage and make sure, those young warriors were ready to fight. And we did a lot of boxing. Then Corporal Bell, Barry Bell, he had a lot of background growing up, which I'm going to ask for him to talk about here in a little bit, about boxing. And, he is an individual that has not just a bias for action, but he has a sense and good understanding of what right and wrong is. And he will get in the ring and fight his best with everything he has, to make sure that, he wins the cause that he's fighting for, whether it's, with gloves on against an opponent. And that's something that we tested, often, not just, when we had some downtime, is a morning physical fitness. When we were out in the field, even deployed in the desert in California or deployed overseas, we'd break the gloves and mouthpieces out and get it on. And here's a man that would, definitely fight and enjoyed that good, healthy competition. And he enjoyed that camaraderie and esprit de corps. He actually, after his tour of duty in the Marine Corps, he went on and went to college, completed his bachelor's degree, studying political science. He went on and, started a family, and then decided, hey, I want to serve our nation again. Unfortunately, due to age restrictions, the Marine Corps said, he was above the age requirement to become an officer. So he looked at the other services and gained a commission in the United States Army. And he's going to talk a little bit about that and how he served as an intelligence officer, which further shows, his commitment to our country, his knowledge of, the government system, its good and its bad. And he has a good, solid understanding of our nation's enemies and the processes of how we determine where they are and how to go about identifying, close-withing, and destroying. He knows that. He knows it very well. He is very determined to win for our country and those individuals which he may be privileged here to represent. But we have an outstanding gentleman, and he has served in many places across the country, to include the West Coast and California and Washington. He served as a combat veteran of Afghanistan, and he deployed as a Marine twice overseas, once with me, and I had the distinct privilege of serving with him then and reconnecting with him now. So we have a lot to talk about, to include his son, who was named after a gentleman that served in our platoon, but also his son just graduated Marine Corps boot camp in San Diego, California, and is moving on to his initial schools and beginning his service for his initial tour in the Marine Corps. So here's a gentleman, not only a patriot, but the the Marine Corps and the United States is actually getting quite a bit of bang for their buck from the Bell family. So, again, welcome to the Go Commando show, Barry Bell. How are you doing?
I'm good. Thanks, Major Galvin, and fellow commandos. I appreciate the time to come on here and to make my case and just to kind of tell some old stories and make fun of ourselves a little bit as well. So those were definitely some fun times back in the day. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, and Barry, when you were growing up, tell us a little bit about those early days and what led you to decide to join the Marine Corps. How old were you, and what were those thoughts in your head?
I grew up. My father was a Marine, and my grandfather was also a Marine, and he fought in Korea. And he used to tell me, because I was kind of one of these kids that's very mischievous, and I was going. If you've seen the movie Old Yeller, and Arliss, who was a character in there, was always out and getting muddy and catching animals. I was that kid. I was out there in the mud with my dog, and I ran around all the time. And I used to hear my grandfather's stories from Korea. And one of the things I used to do, that made a big impact on me. And one of the things I used to do when I lived with them was I would go out and I would attack hills, or I would set up rocks and pretend like it was a post. I know it may sound kind of silly, but I used to do that, me and my dog. And because I didn't have any neighbors when I lived with my grandparents, and so that's one of the things that I would do to kind of entertain myself. Now, one of the things my granddad used to say to me, he says, "The day you turn 18, I'm shipping your rear end off to the Marine Corps." He didn't live to see that happen, but so I was like, well, if I'm going to have to do that, I need to learn about the Marine Corps. So I used to get our encyclopedia world books, and I used to read Marine Corps history, and I used to actually go into the field and shout the Marines hymn. I learned it when I was in the 5th grade, and that was something I was there, me and my dog, and it's just bringing back some memories. But anyway, that's something that made an impression early on. And I moved around a lot as a kid. My parents split up when I was very young, and I moved around living with different parents. And when I was 15 years old, I was kicked out of my house, and I moved in with my great grandmother. Now here was a lady in her 70s, retired, didn't need some 15-year-old punk showing up at her door, but here I was, and she had 2 rules. She said, "You'll go to school every day and you won't drink," and I said, "That's easy enough." So that became a pretty stable part of my life. And then after high school, I didn't want to go to college right away, but I started college, and I was like, this isn't for me. I've been going to school, for 13 years. I'm looking for something else. So I checked out the other services, and the thing that attracted me most of the Marine Corps, not just family history, but also it's like a brotherhood thing. And that's what I would hear from other Marines. So that's what led me to join the Marine Corps. It's kind of a long story to get there, but that's kind of how that happened.
So also growing up, Barry, you guys played a lot of sports. And what were some of those favorite sports and why?
Me and my brothers, we played football, of course, in neighborhoods, and that's rough and tumble, but I also played organized football all the way up until high school, and a couple of years in high school. I ran track, and I also swam in high school, and I wrestled 1 year in high school. But for us, my dad was probably the biggest influence on me playing those sports, because my dad's a rough and physical guy. He was a professional boxer at one time himself, and he also played football. And that was a big influence, because we worked out. Like, my dad made us work out as we were kids. And so that was something that, working out, you got to also get rid of that energy. So sports is a good place to channel that. So it also taught us about organizing as teams. Sometimes I might be the quarterback, and sometimes I wouldn't be. I might be on the line. So I learned, learn different positions in play. So that was something that kind of influenced my life throughout my younger years, through my forming years.
Okay, and about boxing, what attracted you to that? Now that's a sport. Obviously, you're in contact with somebody, and you have to understand their mindset, and you're working to defeat them. And if you don't, they're going to defeat you. They're going to physically punish you. It's not like a game of chess where it's all mental. It's both mental and physical, and there's some immediate pain. But what led your desire to continue on and pursue being very competitive in boxing?
That came from my dad. Like I was mentioning earlier, my father was a professional boxer, and before that he was amateur boxer, and actually got his boxing start in the Marine Corps after high school. That's where he kind of got started doing that. And he made us do that as well. We trained, and my older brother was 3 years older than myself, and 3 years difference between us. And he used to beat the crap out of me, Fred. I mean, just, it was pretty bad. I thought, I'm good, I'm fast, I should be able to beat him up. But it just didn't work out that way. So that was kind of a driving motivation. And, of course, we got in neighborhood fights as kids. Nothing serious, just you kind of grew up that way. And, my dad pressed that upon me, and I got to an appreciation and understanding, that it's not just about getting out there and swinging. I may have to slip a jab or two here and there, a duck and bob and weave and all those kinds of things, and you got to plan it out. So that's something that you also learn and you carry with you as you go through in life. And when I turned 15, I said to my dad, I was like, I've had enough. This is like right before I got thrown out of my mom's home, but I said, I've had enough. I don't want to do this anymore. But my dad was smart in teaching me, because about a year later, I needed it. I got in a couple of fights in high school where I just wore some people out. And if I didn't have those skills, it could have gone the other way, because these were guys who were bigger than me. They wanted to take me to the ground and wrestle, but I was able to keep my distance and keep them off of me and just wear them out. I was getting a little bit in the weeds to some stuff, but that's it made a big impact in my life, and it's something that I kind of passed on to my son in a different way, because I also studied some mixed martial arts and some kung fu. And, with my oldest two, I kind of passed that on to them playing around, and we just wrestled a lot growing up with the kids. And my son was telling me during, Marine Corps boot camp that what the Marine Corps, I don't think they call it a combative program, I forget exactly what they call it, but he was telling me that everything came natural to him because of what we did growing up. So that was something I was like, okay, that's a good impression. But so I passed that on to him to some degree, and it's been useful for him as well.
Yes, and speaking of that, just like your transition when you were a young high school student and you were playing competitive sports to include boxing, there's not a lot that's hidden, whether it's in the ring, whether it's on the field, and then you transition into infantry, and it was probably very natural for yourself, much like it was for myself being an athlete. But what I want to get at is, some of the Marines that I've talked to over the years, they always describe like those were the best years of their lives. They reflect back on times when everything was completely open and transparent. You lived in a ship squad bay in berthing areas, we called it, where there's hundreds of other people in a small room, so nothing's really hidden besides maybe some personal mail that you can shove in a small little private little locker and everything. But those times we build some really close, intimate relationships with those that we're serving with. And do you have any particular example or two of some of the best lessons and experiences that you had while you were in the Marine Infantry?
Yeah, here's a couple. When you're having to sleep in a vehicle, it's hard, but try to eat better food. Your close quarters, some things like that, it gets messy and dirty, but the same with on the ship. But you got to learn to respect each other and respect each other's space, because everybody's tired. Everybody's working hard as you, and so there's no time for pity parties. So that's one of the things that growing up in the infantry that I learned. But the other thing is, too, is like things happen quick and things change rapidly. And because the way I grew up, living in different places, having to adjust my life all the time, that transitioned into the Marine Corps very well. The Marine Corps and infantry specifically kind of honed that in. And, it's like, the old Marine Corps saying, adapt and overcome. Well, that's 100% true. You have to do that, because you're going to be put in situations that can cost lives. So you need to know your job. It's not like you need to score 70 on a test. You need to know your job, 95% or higher.
Yes.
Because it makes a difference.
Mastery.
Passing the test is not the same as knowing your job and knowing it well. You do these things repetitively. And the discipline, Fred, that I learned from being in the infantry and the Marine Corps actually carried me through my undergrad years, because I was a horrible student, honestly, growing up. I just didn't care about school too much. But when I got into college, like, I'm paying for this, this is real. I got to have to support my family. And I started doing all my homework assignments twice to get me into a mode, and it carried me through. But that came from being in the infantry and just having to do things repetitively and learn them, and then be able to perform them later on. And in college, the case was passing exams.
Well, that's very important because many people are the same way. They may not see that sense and purpose, and then they get in the Marines, and right away when they get off the bus and there's a drill instructor yelling at them, they see the yellow footprints, and then they get into, they finish boot camp, they get into the infantry, then they understand, like mistakes in the infantry can cost lives, and that is not something that is just in wartime. In peacetime, when you're training on a range, those mistakes end up, costing many people's lives if you don't, focus and pay attention. And in today's day and age, it's very hard with every technological advantage. I mean, people are very distracted, but it is very important. And as you've mentioned, this phase that we're talking about, you took a lot out of the Marine Corps. You had a good, strong understanding that, like, hey, these people serving to your left and your right, they're bigger than yourself. I mean, you're all part of the same team. And, I know on our deployment, and we actually got this emergency deployment order, and we left a month early to go into, the plan was we were going to defend Kuwait again, like the second Desert Storm, because Saddam Hussein had kicked those NATO weapons inspectors out of Iraq. And so it really was real for us. It triggered in our head that, our lives may be required of us, that this is for real. And I'm sure you took that with you as you left out of the Marine Corps and went to college. But tell us about, you just mentioned that, your academics in pursuing your bachelor's, but then you decided to serve again. And what led you to, serve in the Army as a commissioned officer and then going into the intelligence field? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
When I graduated, I realized that what I had got my degree in wasn't very useful. And, I thought about, because I interned in college for a congressman, and I thought about trying to go that route as far as like being on the staff or something like that, but all those people were attorneys. So I wasn't competitive. So I worked out in the world, and I was like, making money is fine, it's good, but there's no purpose. I didn't feel like I had a purpose. So I began praying, because at that time, before that, I was kind of drifting away from the Lord. And I got on my knees and started praying, God, what do you want me to do? And a friend of mine had sent me a book called The Purpose-Driven Life by Rick Warren. Many people have read it. And I read the first 20 chapters. It was a chapter a day. I was like, okay, I get the point of this book. So my takeaway was, we're here to serve God in accordance with our talents and attributes. That's what I took away from that. And I was like, what was I good at? I was good in the Marines. I did a good job there. And I enjoyed it. So I first went to the Marines, and you kind of mentioned this earlier, and the officer selection officer told me I was too old. So I was like, well, okay. So I went and checked out some of the other branches, and, I didn't like what they had to offer. And I was on my way home. And because at the time, I believed that God was telling me back into the military. It's something I couldn't get out of my mind. It was like a splinter. It was just there. And so I'm driving home, and I'm like, Lord, am I hearing you correctly? Are you influencing me to go to the military? And right as I was saying this, I kind of looked to my left, and I see the Army recruiting station. So I just whipped my car in there really fast, and I walked in, I looked at the recruiter, sergeant first class, and I said, I'm 32 years old. I have a bachelor's degree. I'm a former Marine. Can I be a pilot in the Army? He says, yeah, have a seat. So we get to talking, and we're talking about Warrant Officer Candidate School at first, be a pilot. And then I started inquiring about OCS. He says, well, if you go to OCS, I can't guarantee that you'll be a pilot. I was like, well, I have good scores, right? And he said, yeah, that doesn't really matter. So I took a chance and went to OCS, and was designated to be part of the MI branch. Now, funny thing about that is I had fellow candidates wanting to buy my branch. They wanted to do a rotation. They were willing to pay me money to do that. So I was like, no. So, because I could see the future, and I could look ahead to see that this might be useful in the future. This will be interesting. So I became an MI officer with ILBC in Arizona, and then I got to my first unit. First I started out. We were creating a brand new striker brigade. Funny enough, LAVs back to strikers, so very similar platform. So we were putting together a brand new striker brigade, and the unit was brand new. There was hardly no one there, and our brigade commander at the time was Lieutenant Colonel, who would eventually become A1 Cav squad commander. So he kind of had first pick of people. So I was going to be his S2 for a while. So I was in the S2, really just kind of helped setting up the battalion and monitoring the development of the company. It was almost a bit like franchising. But so I got my first pick as platoon because of the job I had done while we were setting up the brigade. So I became the platoon leader for the human intelligence platoon. And what had happened is it had been reorganized where all of the human collection assets and the counterintelligence personnel were pushed into the military intelligence company. So in my platoon, I had up to 1.70 people in that platoon. And that was a great time to be a platoon leader because I got to be the best of both worlds. I got to be sort of play infantry and grunt with these guys because they were going to be out forward with the grunts. But I also, had the aspect of being able to study and read and, put together reports, look them over, and the planning and all that. So it was kind of the best of both worlds for me. And so that was a really fun time because it played to my strengths. After that, because they wanted me to get some diversity, they sent me over to the analysis to be the platoon leader there. Well, that, and also at the same time, I was the company executive officer. So after that, for deployment, I became the brigade's collection manager, which, I used to explain to my kids for people who aren't in the military, it's my job to go out and find the bad guys and someone else to go and get them. And that's the simple way to explain it with all the different collection assets we have. So that's kind of a broad stroke from my time in college to where I deployed to Afghanistan as a captain in the U.S. Army.
Okay, so Barry, you're serving now at this point in time in your career that we're describing in the U.S. Army as an intelligence officer, and they taught you a lot of lessons that are very important because you are making decisions based on information as you had described, and what a lot of listeners may not understand is he's talking about human intelligence. That's information that we get from various sources that may have been detained. We may have people getting information out in the different villages and districts of the countries that we're in, and that gets fused with other types of intelligence, signals, interceptions. It gets, from satellite imagery, from drones. There is a lot of stuff going on, and in this day and age, it can literally be overwhelming because we have so much assets and resources. So what I want to talk to you a little bit about is you realize, that this is a lot of work and that it's also important because based on compiling all this information and, just like it talks in the stories that Jesus mentioned, like you're given talents and you can either put them in the ground and do nothing with them, or you can do something, to the best of your ability. That is, that's what we're supposed to do. It's not something, okay or good, but we are supposed to do our very, very best. And that can actually drive you to exhaustion as you're doing all this stuff. But tell us a little bit about, that the decisions you are recommending to that commander who's going to make the final decision and employ those soldiers, that's going to involve life or death based upon what you and your soldiers and your team are synthesizing and fusing and providing that recommendation. Tell the listeners a little bit about that responsibility and sort of that process.
That's a good question, Brett. We go right back to OCS real quick because it kind of plays into my answer. And the best class period of instruction that I ever had at OCS was actually from the chaplain. He was speaking to our entire group, and he really pressed upon us, look, you're going to be leading America's sons and daughters into combat. We are in combat. We are in a war right now. He's like, I need you guys to process, the guys and girls, to process that. And that was something, that was a huge weight because it became real in an even different kind of way. So that's a huge responsibility. So fast forward that time in Afghanistan, the commander comes out with his priority intelligence requirements, and we were attached to our regional command south there in Kandahar province. And every week it was part of my duty to go to the region headquarters and advocate for collection assets, those things, that look from the sky, that listen in, or to other various assets, full motion video from drones, etc. So it was our job to advocate on behalf of those. The second time that I went up there, I realized that was just a show. It was a joke. And I was very frustrated because it's like, what are we doing here? So the third time I went to this meeting, after I had a discussion with my Brigade S2, I was up there, and I raised my hand and I said, what are we doing here? We're not having discussions about which assets, which resources each unit should get. We've come up here and you guys are telling us, and it's the same unit getting all these resources, getting 90% of the full motion video, most of the GMTI. Luckily, we had our own unit who could perform analysis on the J-STARS information. So that was a benefit we had, but it was a show. So I get up there and I kind of raise a fuss, and it creates contention. And all of a sudden, everybody's realizing, hey, this is right. So, everybody's kind of raising their hand saying, what's up? Well, I leave that meeting, Fred, and a Special Forces captain came up to me, and he grabbed by the arm. He's like, I am so glad that you said what you said. He goes, this has been the same way, and I've already been here 4 months. I am so thankful. So after that, every week, we were fighting and arguing among assets. Ultimately, the command made decisions that they did, but that was something like I didn't feel like I was doing my job to provide the information necessary to my commander, which our soldiers needed on the ground, if I wasn't up there fighting for them at those meetings. And it became one of those things where you're beating your head against the wall. My S3, he thought that I wasn't doing the job, the operations officer. So him and the colonel go up there, and they find out, hey, I was right. That this is just a show. It's a joke. And then there was a memo sent to the Secretary of the Army about my unit's time while we were in Afghanistan. It tries to address some of those issues, but that was a very real issue. So getting back to how you serve and how you lead your junior soldiers and your NCOs, I had an NCO who went around to Regional Command South talking to the Dutch and our other allies there and getting them to provide collection assets for us outside of what the plan was from Regional Command South. So we were borrowing, and stealing assets, not literally stealing, but the information that they provide, and that was really beneficial. And I had a great NCO who went ahead, and he was like a salesman for our brigade, and he pulled that information in. We made friends, and it almost became like backroom door stuff. Essentially, is what it became. But you have to find ways to serve and to get the information that you need for your junior soldiers and NCOs.
So you just gave an example of how you were in combat in Afghanistan in one of the heights of the surge of American forces in a very violent area, in Regional Command South, which is in and around Kandahar, Afghanistan. It was very violent back then. You're making a lot of decisions that involve whether American and other coalition forces that we're allied with, live or die. So what I want to ask next is, the Army has a lot of good, just like the Marine Corps and other services, a lot of good leadership traits. And you had just defined some examples of what you're talking about regarding, courage, initiative, selfless service. Those are all great, but what do you think the most important leadership characteristic and trait is that you learned from being an Army intelligence officer that you've applied in the business and now looking at becoming a candidate for Congress?
I would say the most important for anything in life is character. It has to start with character. We all make mistakes, but everything starts with character, and then you go on to your presence, with your bearing and how people see you in a situation. But then you also have to be tenacious. In my current role with an accounting firm I work for, Sometimes things aren't necessarily going the way I want them to go as far as a project, but I have to step in with a little more tenacity. So it's almost like a throwback to those days, But I work with very professional people, and that isn't always the case. But sometimes, it is. But character being number one, you have to be tenacious. In that environment I was just describing to you, I was a junior captain. Now they didn't know how junior. They didn't know I just got promoted to captain a month before. And I was now a senior captain, majors, and colonels. So it was a big risk, but. The tenacity that I have, I brought there, and I took advantage of it and used it to our advantage and our unit's advantage.
Yes, and then you left the Army after your tour duty. You were married. You had a lot of things on your mind as far as what to do next, and you began, what a lot of people don't take advantage of is a period where you were able to spend some time reflecting on what's, most important in life. Spent a lot of time alone in isolation, hiking the Appalachian Trail. And what were some of those things that you reflected on that were truly important during that period?
See, I became disillusioned with why we were there. So that was something that was on my mind, but I put that aside because I still had work I had to do. I was there a year, so I had to, focus on getting the job done. But when I came home, I could have immediately gone to work for some three-letter agencies or other contractors in the intel field, but I didn't. I took time off to think about what I experienced over there, what life is like for soldiers, airmen, Marines, sailors coming home. They get injured. I had some friends that lost legs that were severely injured over there. So I reflected on that, and one of the things I got to thinking of, there was a sergeant who said something to me, and this has stuck to me to this day. And a lot of times you find that veterans have a hard time with employment after they get out of the military. And I was discussing that with him, and he said, sir, what happens is you get in an area in your combat, and you have this heightened sense of awareness all the time, and you might be responsible for a team or a platoon or squad and all this equipment and money. You have a lot of responsibility. And then when you get out to the civilian world, you don't have that. So he was describing not having the same kind of purpose, the same type of rewarding job satisfaction. That's something I thought about a lot. I contemplated a lot during that time. And I reflect deeply on the wars themselves because I became very frustrated with why I believe we were still there and us going into Iraq, which this month is the 15th anniversary of us marching into Iraq. But also I reflect on what is most important in life, and it's God and the family, and that's really it. Everything else comes second, but at the same time, God did give us talents and attributes to go out and serve Him in a particular way, and I was placed in a position to never actually kill anyone, and I find that to be a blessing. And I believe that God sent me, is pushing me to go back in the military because He had to teach me something about myself. And that was something else I reflect on. What am I good at? Well, I'm good at seeing things in space and time. And what I mean by that is whether we're talking about planning for collection or I'm talking about planning projects in my current role for my employer, is I see things that are coming up down the road that need to be planned for way before we get there. It's the ability to look ahead, knowing the time frame to start and stop, and everything in between. So you have to fit everything in there. And I reflected on a lot of that. It was very beneficial to me, and it also helped me kind of wind down. And then after that, I went back to grad school and became an MBA graduate.
Yes, and that's even more added to your ability to think deep and look at and plan for some of the things coming up on the horizon. And taking that experience that you had as an intelligence officer in Afghanistan, where you're synthesizing all these assets that we have, and you're providing a recommendation to your commander and other commanders in your organization, to go out and fight and conduct operations. You said that after you left the Army, you were reflecting on a lot of why we were there. And I can sort of understand and realize that, the men on the ground, the men and women out there doing the fighting and supporting, they often know what to do, how to do it, but now there's been some different rules of engagement, which are controlled by the U.S. Congress. Also, some things that are controlled by the Congress is, the amount of aid that we give to these countries. And, those are things that, when we support countries such as Pakistan and many others who, want to see either the death of our allies, or they, oftentimes support terrorism in training camps that are out there training and preparing to kill our warriors. What are some of your thoughts now that you have seen the whole process, and some things that contradict each other, some things that our members of Congress are doing to restrict the rules that don't allow our, Army soldiers, Marines, airmen, sailors to win? And then also, we're actually paying billions of dollars to many of these countries that harbor and host and support terrorism directly and indirectly. I mean, many of them, are fully understanding and, knowing accomplices to supporting, terrorist activities. So, what are those thoughts going into this political campaign, this race to become a member of Congress, that you would have on, the aid to these countries and those rules of engagement for our warriors?
So regarding that, the roughly $50 billion that we donate in foreign aid, I'm with the president on his whole theme about America first. But for me, it might mean a little bit different, something a little bit different than what the president. Now, I believe he cut out the funding to Pakistan, and that's great. But honestly, I think we should cut funding all foreign aid. And let me tell you why. Last year, Americans donated $490 billion to charities in this country, and roughly 280-something billion of that came from individuals. So if there's overseas causes that Americans want to donate to, Americans donate to Israel. We also provide them with foreign aid as well, but that can be made up in private donations. It doesn't have to rely on taxpayer-funded issues, by the taxpayers. I believe it should actually stop. Now, I wouldn't say you cut it off immediately for the same reason you don't, if you're trying to recuperate someone from drug addiction, you don't cut them off immediately. It has dire consequences. But it needs to be ratcheted back slowly and ended within a maybe 2 to 3 year time frame. I had to put a date on it, but it needs to end, because if we have to buy our friends, that's a serious problem. Now, there are those countries that we donate to that have serious poor people, and all that can be made up by contributions from the American people. And that way, it's voluntary. You're giving to organizations or causes that you need. And that $50 billion, throw back in the budget, because we've got some serious deficits going on.
Yes. And Barry, there's another topic I want to talk to you about that's near and dear to my heart, and that's a right to speech. And it's been very apparent, recently that people are attacking different groups of people by just calling people racist and trying to get them to shut up and not say anything, and just trying to make like an imposed, not self-imposed, but people are trying to project on other people that they're racist without. And often the target is, different groups of people that's completely unwarranted. There's a lot of division in that aspect of our country. But my question is in regards to free speech. There has recently been, in the past year, 3 bills that have been put up, and I'm going to briefly talk about these. One's HR 569, and the other one is SJ Resolution 49, and then another is H.RES 257, and these go against like what we see underneath the apex of the Supreme Court, and that is equal justice under the law. They basically provide certain categories of individuals an unequal right. They make them like a privileged group that if anybody says anything about this particular person, and who knows what that, is, who can judge if that's, offensive or not, but it's basically taken away freedom of speech. Now, I understand if, people are, portraying, provoking words or a hostile threat, they're actually, crazy people doing certain things like that. That's a little bit different. But, these are, again, all trying to provide a special class or a category of people that basically, if given that kind of special category or endangered species status, these people can act in a little bit different manner. And I don't, myself as a citizen, I don't believe any Americans should have. I mean, this isn't like a monarchy in like England or France or any other country like they had before, where certain people could get away with saying whatever because they were royalty or elite and privileged. In America, our founding fathers decided that we will not have anything like that. But there has been recently, I just read, and I want your viewers of the Go Commando show to understand, like, look these things up. It may seem like the right thing to do, but anytime we start going in a direction where certain people have these privileges that other people don't, and they can act in a certain way, and if anybody does or says anything, how it's written in these is to become law is that, people can be fined or imprisoned if they say such things that others find offensive. What are your thoughts on some of these recent congressional acts that restrict our American freedoms, such as our freedoms of speech?
Well, number one, it would be in violation of the First Amendment. But you cannot legislate morality. You can't legislate politeness. And political correctness is really the illegitimate child of demagogues. So political correctness, although it doesn't limit our free speech, but what it does, it's very close to abridging that right. You mentioned about not being able to say certain things in public or refer to groups a certain way. Now, there's a difference between being polite and kind company and telling it like it is. And you need to tell it like it is, and people need to have thicker skin. But getting back to the law, you can't legislate morality, as I just said. But political correctness leads to the infringement of free speech, which will lead to other things. The First Amendment to the Constitution, is about free speech and freedom of religion, but those rights don't come from government. They come from God. And the First and Second Amendment both are there to basically say, we have these rights, and the government should not infringe upon them. And that's one of the things you get close to. You start trying to legislate morality, which you cannot do, no matter how hard you try, because it's imperfect man trying to legislate their particular beliefs or ideas on others, especially when it comes down to individual behavior. Now, you mentioned about different, always someone being called a racist. Racism is disgusting and it's despicable, and there's no place for it in our society, in a multicultural society. That's another great thing, actually, about the military, is you have this broad swath of America, this huge cross-section of America comes into one place, and if you've grown up in some kind of ethnic silo, then you're going to learn a lot, and you're going to learn that maybe what you thought about certain types of people isn't the case. And some of your best friends are going to be someone that you didn't think they would be, growing up. So that's another great thing about the military as well. But back to the political correctness, it's demagoguery, and it's a polite word for demagoguery. It's actually a PC term for itself, but it borderlines on demagoguery, and it's not abridging our freedom of speech, but it's getting close. In Canada, they passed. They had a law recently that we were discussing about compelled speech, and that's the next evolution is compelled speech, I think, in that regard. And it must be fought every step of the way.
Yes, and another question that a lot of listeners have on their minds is on the issue of, guns and gun violence. People want to talk about gun control now. A lot of people on one side of the camp, and they talk about an example such as Australia, where they came in The government bought back all the guns, a very expensive program. They also, very carefully omit that there is massive violent crime surge since doing that in Australia, or some show the exact opposite side, like in Switzerland, where it's mandatory of ownership of weapons, and then they don't have crime. But those two examples of great countries, anybody that's traveled there loves to visit, and they have fond things to say about Australia and Switzerland. But what I want to talk about is, historical and even recent, world history, when there's nations that are superpowers, such as America. And when you concentrate that much power, which our founding fathers always realized was very, very dangerous, and when you concentrate that much power with a few people in the government, and all these 100% of these examples in the past, whether it's been a very powerful country in a very modern now country like Japan, but here in this last century, we see when Japan had a very concentrated power under the emperor, and they started making mandatory disarmament. Like when I was stationed in Okinawa, they couldn't even own any kind of weapon whatsoever, and it created a situation which allowed the Japanese to just not impose their will only on their countrymen, but all across an entire area of the globe. But we saw other superpowers in many other periods, such as China. When they did this, they ended up killing 77 million. That's almost unfathomable. Right now, it's just figure a fifth of our population being wiped out, and Russia did the same thing. With 66 million, being killed. That's people always bring up Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany, and those atrocities killed 21 million. But when you figure 66 million or 77 million, these are atrocities. And the one thing they all have in common is these were superpowers. These were governmental systems that had a high concentration of power with a few key individuals that really went to their heads, and it led to forced disarmament amongst all the, not just their own people, but the different colonies. So allowed the government to abuse those powers. And what are your thoughts on a lot of, guns can do some horrible things, but we have different things in American societies that have higher number of deaths, whether it's fists, hammers. We don't have laws or signs outside of banks or anything else that say don't bring a hammer or a fist in here. But what are your thoughts on our Second Amendment rights and many people's knee-jerk reaction to completely remove or impose restrictions on the right to bear arms and have militias?
So there's quite a bit there. Let me try to unpack. So, yeah, you mentioned the disarmament from China and Russia, and then there's Afghanistan, Vietnam did it once upon a time, Latin America, all these communist countries did it. There's over 100 million deaths, from gun confiscation. And in Germany, after World War I, if I remember reading my history properly, they began to register the guns first. And then they started, when Hitler came to power, they started confiscating them from enemies, if you will, enemies of the state. And those ended up being the Jews and gypsies and anybody else they considered undesirable. And we know how that worked out. With 6 million Jews and others dead. So our fundamental right to bear arms, again, doesn't come from the Constitution. It just states that it shall not be infringed upon, which means the government doesn't give us that right. I mean, they can't take it away from us. It's a negative right. And, gun violence in our country is actually way down, even when I was in high school. So homicides are down. Gun violence overall is down. But one of the things about gun violence you don't hear about, you got to break that down into categories, because you're going to have homicides, you're going to have suicides, you're going to have accidental deaths. 2/3 of all gun violent deaths are suicides. So what's something that we can do about that? Well, if you have a gun in your home with small children, either lock it up or hide it and teach them about gun safety. Teach them to respect what that firearm can do. If you're a household without guns, you don't have to worry about that as much. But also, we got to pay attention to where our children's mental states are. If they're depressed and things like that. But you can't tell. You can't provide data to suffering parents, like the recent Parkland shooting down there. You can show them all the data and facts ad nauseum, but it doesn't make them feel any better. So what's going on is a knee-jerk reaction based on emotion and not reason, not data. So you need to take a step back and not try to take advantage or demagogue a tragedy like took place in Parkland and many other places. But overall, gun violence is down. The FBI statistics bear this out. But nobody else wants to talk about it. We have more people die from opioid deaths. That's a huge crisis in our country as well. But the Founding Fathers did absolutely right by looking into the future and seeing what possibly could happen with disarmament, and said we need to put this in there, even though it doesn't come from government. We need to put that in or make it explicit so it's not ambiguous at all.
You're right. They actually did a very effective job at seeing the unseen. That if we disarm, our founding fathers looked deep in what they put in writing did actually come true in other places across the globe in history. Anytime a superpower has disarmed its society or its colonies and places that they have gone and conquered, it is never, ever, there's not one example where it worked out well, for those. It's usually led to a revolution or, a slaughter, mixture of the two. It's usually horrible.
Here's another thing about, I get tired of hearing the news, well, you don't need an AR-15 to hunt. Well, who are you to decide what I need to hunt? I may not want to hunt with an AR-15 because I need a 30-06 bolt-action rifle. But the other thing, there's like 300 million guns in this country. But here's another thing. If you're China, if you're Russia, and you think that you're going to invade us, not only do you have to get past our military, but how many of us own guns? That is a huge counterinsurgency possibility that they don't want to deal with. We will be the last ones standing at the doors of people's houses. Because if the military gets pushed, then you have armed Americans and former veterans and military and cops and good old boys and good old girls out there with their guns. And so that's an insurgency waiting to happen. Nobody wants to mess with us. That's something any enemy has to take into calculation when they're putting their plans together if they want to try to invade the United States.
Just to reinforce that, one of the earlier interviews we had was with Dr. Peter Vincent Pry, a career CIA officer whose background and expertise is not only in electromagnetic pulse attacks, but it is also he's the current chief of staff of the congressionally mandated electromagnetic pulse task force. And what he mentions several times is an armed society. The importance of it is because if you get rid of our electric grid, if you fire a nuclear weapon and it detonates right over the center of the United States and shuts down power as we know it, everything from watches, car batteries, it shuts our society down. And then another country comes in and basically what would happen, the CIA's estimate is that 75 to 90% of Americans would just die of the first year from health-related illnesses, from starvation to nuclear power plants, going chaotic. And then, a country, if we were disarmed, could very easily. So, my point is people don't understand, one of the lessons that we talk about in the Marine Corps and military is most dangerous course of action. And the most dangerous course of action is that, not in a perfect case, when it's 70 degrees and you're on the west coast of California, but something goes wrong. America's attacked by modern military weapons such as electromagnetic pulse. Our electric grid goes down, and then we are conquered because we don't have any means of defending ourselves at the local levels, and then we are ruled by people. And those that want to quickly react and oppose guns, educate yourself a little bit on history of what's going on in countries, Belgium, Poland, France, any of these countries that people rolled right over. Look very carefully at what happened to those people, to their women. Look at what happened in America, in Philadelphia, when after we wrote the Declaration of Independence. I mean, there was 8 years of fighting thereafter, and the British came into Philadelphia harbor. Look what happened the winter of 1777 to our own, wives and daughters with the British soldiers. I mean, that happens in the world. And if you trust that everybody's going to be just get along peacefully and that there's going to be unicorns and rainbows, you need to have some real strong coffee, because that's not how the world really is. But thanks for your input and a strong stance on that, because I know that's something that Americans that do look deep into the future, like our founding fathers did, understand the reality and the need to defend ourselves in a strong, very, very powerful way at the local level. Next question I have is also pertaining to what we're seeing across the entire country, and that is dealing with illegal immigration. A lot of people think, and I think these people are, and often many, but not all cases, very hypocritical. These most people I know that have a lot of wealth that talk about this and pontificate from a, congressional platform, that say we shouldn't have borders, and I'm sure they have not only personal security details, but they have locks on their doors. If not, they live in a secure building and work in a secure office space, like any of the House or Senate office buildings that you go through a metal detector. But my point is, in regards to illegal immigration, we do have systems in place to protect the elite, and it's very hypocritical because those people that make those laws that profess and pontificate to make sure everybody else here on Main Street America that doesn't have these protections that our elite have, that they should be living with anybody that wants to come into our country from any kind of culture. They don't have to know our language background. And there's two things I see really as a big problem with this, and I want you to elaborate on them after I finish asking the question, because here in the middle of America, we've seen immigration come in and it attacks the middle of America, the middle class and working class, by taking jobs. These people come in, they'll bring a whole family in, often illegally. They're not paying taxes, which is a big thing that people think that, this is great, but they're not paying, they're not contributing, but they're sending people to schools, and they're also, is like they say in these sanctuary cities, residents, they're collecting, benefits besides schools. They're getting, medical benefits, educational benefits. They're getting compensation in many forms. So they're a burden, financial burden, and they're providing a product that may be very inexpensive, but it's costing somebody a job in America. The other thing too is in my business in the inner city, and I see this a lot. What also illegal immigration brings, and that is crime. And two of the crimes that I think are most despicable are the violent crimes that come from a lot of these gangs that come up here and they're selling drugs. They're controlling certain areas with guns and violence, and they're often bringing in and kidnapping individuals, which they, a few years ago, I didn't know much about this program when I was in the bubble of the Marine Corps. I lived on a base, and I wasn't surrounded by this human trafficking, but that's a very real thing, that people kidnap American, young kids, and they get them hooked on these drugs, and then they sell them to, sick individuals that are, doing whatever with them. That these are horrible, horrible crimes that, destroy lives and families with drugs, with violence, and attack our jobs. And a lot of people just think that, again, everything's rainbows and unicorns. Everything's fine. These are residents. And Barry, you're campaigning to be a member of Congress. This is something that I think is very important and I think is very personal to a lot of people. Can you talk a little bit about illegal immigration and its pros and cons, if there is any pros?
So regarding the costs of immigration, this is something that I pay attention to and read on my own from time to time, like I do many other things. And sort of the net cost to America is roughly $116 billion. I mean, looking at what we pay in education for their kids, what they may receive in some type of aid, and using our roads, and you take all these things into consideration, they do work, and they may be stealing someone's ID if they're actually paying federal taxes or paying income taxes. There's probably identity theft there. They do pay some taxes through sales tax and whatnot, but it is nowhere near what the media wants you to believe. I mean, one of the recent numbers that I saw was like the total national cost was like $134 billion. And then you take that, you subtract what they contribute, and that came to like $116 billion. So there's a huge cost of what it costs taxpayers for illegal immigrants. Now, I understand the draw to come here. I do, having visited some other countries, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. But, taking our jobs, I can't find, data on there that's consistent, but I can give a personal story on that. When I was 17 years old, 15, 16, 17, I used to work in the summertime hauling hay back home. And the co-op would hire us. I think minimum wage back then was $3.85, something like that. Well, it came to the fourth season to haul hay. We all kind of show up. We're ready. We know when it's time to start this. We're like, we're not going to hire you guys this year. We're like, why? Why not? And I look over, and there's a bunch of immigrants over there from down south from Mexico. And I instantly got mad. I was like, why are you hiring them? They're like, well, they're going to work for $2 an hour, cash. And I was thinking to myself, I was infuriated because legally they have to pay me the $3.85 minimum wage at the time. So that's a real story. And I get tired of hearing people say, well, they take the jobs that Americans don't want. Well, that may be the case sometimes. But, if Americans don't want a job, they need to reevaluate themselves, instead of getting on the dole. But getting back to, or referencing, you mentioned human trafficking. That, too, I would say over the last year is something I really started studying, and particularly sex trafficking. There's groups out there and advocate groups about that support this and try to bring awareness about. I had no idea how much of a problem this is. And when I was living in Washington, I remember our church was talking about the time. I think Seattle was in the top 10 of cities where children and young adults were kidnapped and thrown into sexual slavery. And so that's something that's extremely disgusting. And who pays for that stuff? It's mostly the elite well-to-do who pay for these types of things and keep these people. But you have these brokers who are the go-betweens who also kidnap these people. So we've seen the crime on television from the MS-13 and the killings from American citizens from someone who's been deported several times. They're allowed to keep coming back and they're allowed to stay here. They snuck back in, and that's a murder that could have been avoided right there if we had enforced our law. So I do support the president's agenda to build a wall. The only way I wouldn't support a wall is if he said, we're going to put screen lines. We want to have LAR and strikers down there on the border, doing some interdicting missions or something like that for drugs and for people who want to just immigrate to the country. Now, with that said, the other part of immigration is human toll and where they come from. And I'll give you an example. If 3 or 4 people, whatever the number, escape from North Korea, we all know what it's like over there. We read, we understand what it is. It's brutal. People are starving over there. They're smaller, than their cousins down south just for malnutrition. If they found a way to get into this country, North Korea, I wouldn't send them back. No way. Absolutely not. It needs to be, I think, looked at on a case-by-case, country-by-country basis. We have a lot of illegals that overstay their visas who are from Western Europeans from countries or other great places to live where it's not like your North Koreas or your Haitis or your Somalias, these places that are absolutely horrible to live in. So, and our neighbors to the south, they don't live in the same conditions as the North Koreas of the world. But that's something that has to be taken into consideration, needs to be looked at. We have to fix, we do need comprehensive immigration reform. I would not support a clean DACA bill because, frankly, you cannot trust anybody to go back and do something else about it. The other party will not work. They get what they want, and then be stuck out in the cold. But the children, the DACA children, I do sympathize with that, and I'll tell you why. If I wanted to risk breaking a law and possibly, being thrown out of the country or whatever, I'll bring in my minor children. They had no choice in the matter. So I think we need to be sympathetic to them. I don't support any type of citizenship for their parents who willingly broke the law and came over here. Absolutely not. For the DACA children, I do support some path to permanent residency. That's kind of where I am on that right now. I've actually evolved and become a little bit lighter-hearted on that because there is the human aspect, and we need to be compassionate towards people. But at the same time, they need to respect our laws. They need to get in line. They need to get in the back of the line because we have a legal system, immigration system, and it's not fair to everyone else who's trying to abide by the rules to come over here.
Yeah, again, that's something that's oftentimes people are very hypocritical. Like I mentioned, the aspect that, some of these elite, they have their own systems of protection that protect them, but, many across America don't have those same, protections when people come in, and there are violent crimes, perpetrated, and I see it all the time in the area that I work in. It's very, very real, and people, they ignore that because they live possibly in bubbles where they don't see it. But just like you mentioned, many people try to, perpetuate that this is just a good thing. These people are they're just trying to do the right thing. They're residents, and they're really not understanding that these politicians, which often have a platform, the media is out there covering them, and it sounds so good. It's such an emotional argument that it's so compelling, but the facts are very, very real. That many of these people come here, illegal drugs, sex trafficking, violent crimes follow, and the reason that a lot of businesses benefit, like you mentioned, you're put out of a job as a young teenager. That was very real. It's tangible. I mean, you couldn't earn an income, and there's people that do want to work that jobs are being taken from because others are coming in here. They're working for less, and those businesses, do exist, and those businesses contribute to, many people who will allow them to continue to do that, and that's why, many of these business owners have people in the coffers, on the right or the left who will vote for those types of, issues, and it's not somebody up there that's just, he sees the light or she sees the light, and this is a good thing. I mean, one thing that I learned in our MBA program, in our public policy class, when we went back to Washington, D.C., they said the most important thing for any member of Congress is re-election. And I saw this past November, going back to Washington, D.C., there's actually a call center under the Capitol that members of Congress go to, and they can call and raise funds. But that's that's a whole nother issue as far as, follow the money, see why these people are supporting this issue. But, the rank and file is often not represented very well because jobs are being taken away. It increases our crime. You and I have both seen, we grew up in a time period where young kids could walk across America. How many main streets do you see young kids running around, after school, late in the evening, riding bicycles freely, safely? Not so many cities is that the case anymore. But when we grew up, and not too long ago, that was the case. Your kids could join a sports team after school. They could run, they could walk the streets, they could ride bicycles, they could meet with other people at different areas across town. And it's not because kids are all on, iPads and games and, gaming. That's not the case. It's the case because of crime, violence, of insecurity, of across almost every city in America, and that was not the case just a few years ago. So those people that are just bleeding in their hearts, I asked them to go back and recall the not too distant future of yesteryear when things were safe and Americans could, trust the average individual across society. But next question, Barry. We have a lot of people, and we saw this last year, from, some things I just find despicable. And in the military, you have to get along with people. You may not necessarily agree with them, but it goes to, party lines. And the point I want to talk about is, can we ever get past gridlock in Congress and get things done? Or, like we saw in the President's State of the Union address, people dressing in a certain color, sitting down, just this whole resistance. And it's, a gridlock because they're just voting party line instead of saying, hey, I see the value in this, and the people in my, it's very rare, for somebody to go away from the party. And that's where I see a really big problem, because our society really is divided. And if we don't reach across the aisle, we're going to have nonstop gridlock. We're not going to get anywhere. And big issues like our budget, which is continuing to be, we can't pass budgets, but just continuing resolutions. We're just kicking the can down the road. We are really screwing the citizens that those members represent. And what is your position on reaching across the aisle to get things done and to move our government forward?
A couple of things. Sometimes gridlock can be a good thing, and I'll tell you why, and that is both parties have proven in Congress that they grow government when they're in charge, and they do it on a bipartisan basis. Voting strictly party lines means you have no spine or no backbone. If for example, if Dennis Kucinich was still in Congress, I'm not a big fan of Dennis Kucinich, but one of the things that I always liked that he was consistent about, and if I get there and if he was stood out to work with him on, that would be the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. That's something, for me, that's something I'm willing to reach across the aisle for. There are certain issues that the reason you belong to a party that you'll vote with that party, such as particularly gun rights or lower taxes, whatnot. But just for the sake of party line vote, that means people have no spine and no backbone. And people wearing these colors, dressed in particular type of ways when the the president is speaking is useless. It's pointless. It's showboating and it's theater. And it's things like that that makes people that I talk to, they hate politics. Most Americans hate politics, and they've become somewhat apathetic because they're tired of that stuff. It's just showboating and aggrandizement, and they demagogue issues. But one of the first things I would do to get up there, I would look at how I feel about each particular issue. I would find my allies in the Republican Party, and I would look to the Democratic Party and say, who over there shares a similar position on the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, or immigration, or who can I work with on that? Sometimes you might have to have backdoor meetings. That's where the sausage gets made. Yeah, there's a legislative process, but the sausage gets made behind closed doors, and it's often ugly, right? But that's something that I'm willing to do and would like to do, because you can't always get everything done. As we've seen with Republicans controlling the House and the Senate, we couldn't get everything done. And it takes bipartisan effort sometimes, but bipartisanship can prove to grow and swell the government just as easily as single-party rules. So that's just something that to keep in mind there.
Yes. Now, there's a lot of folks who believe that, in regards to our national debt, some on one side say it's no big deal. We can, that's a number. It can continue to go up, and it's no big deal. There's many others, including myself, who see that as a way that our sovereignty is threatened, a way that we lose global relevance as the United States, and it continues to grow. And there's a lot of reasons for many of that, and a lot of in the political process are profiting from some of these pork belly projects, especially some of this defense spending and that may sound like, oh, that's not conservative, but we've been at war in Afghanistan. Now we're entering our 17th year as we just started, and there's really no way with this present strategy, which supposedly was revamped, but it's still the same thing, that we are going to win with trying to win the hearts and minds of people that believe in Sharia law and trying to convert them to some Western form of democracy and advanced civilization. But we've spent, as Donald Trump said this last month, $7 trillion on these two wars, and we may have some temporary victories, and those men and women fighting on the ground have done their job. They've fought and they've won, and we haven't lost at that level. But the strategies and the spending and what has caused our nation on the global scale, to lose sovereignty. What are your thoughts and concerns regarding our growing national debt and how to handle that?
To those detractors who say it's not a big deal, then I would say you should support us not paying interest on it anymore. There's a portion of the budget where we pay interest on the national debt, and those payments are only going to go up as interest rates continue to climb. I believe it is a problem. It's been going on for years, and of course it became exacerbated during I think the 2009, 2008 timeframe when the recession hit, and they spent $700 billion on TARP, and that really kind of blew the budget up as well during Obama's administration. But we run deficits every year. I think last year was $800 billion, roughly speaking, and that there's plenty of schools of thought out there about how to rein this in. The first one, the one that gets talked about much, is a balanced budget amendment. And that's something I can support with some caveats. Some other ideas. There's no magic or silver bullet that's going to take care of it when you have the lack of will among politicians to actually balance a budget. Congress, this is like probably asking the hen to guard, or the chicken, or the fox to guard the hen house. But Congress needs to reform its budgetary process. And one of the things it needs to do is it needs to continue to shrink the number of committees and subcommittees that have budgetary responsibility. Now, you have the CBO, but you also have these subcommittees and other committees who have responsibility. And everybody gets their hands in the same pot, and it's harder to track. So that's one of the things that needs to be done. Entitlement reform has to be done, but no one in Congress, well, a few exceptions, no one wants to talk about entitlement reform because of what you were mentioning earlier about getting reelected. You can't have the fear of being thrown out if what you believe is right, but you have to go back and you have to tell the people the truth about what it is and lay it in front of them and make your case. Another idea is to have a rule-based fiscal policy where that we have these automatic constraints put in to spending with some caveats, for such as natural disasters. Okay, we'll go beyond for something like a Hurricane Harvey or something like that, or a declared war. That's a little bit different. So the deficits continue to grow, and with the tax cuts, which I support, and I'll support any tax cut because you're giving the people some of their money back, but you also need to look at the spending. Because, revenues will increase with the tax cuts. More people will be hired, which will raise the coffers, but the treasury will be receiving more money. But also, you got to look at the spending, and it has to be reformed. I think looking at the budget proposal, I believe maybe $60 billion allocated for overseas contingency outside of the regular defense budget. If we bring our boys and girls home, we don't really need that anymore. You get rid of the foreign aid, like I was talking about earlier, or start reducing and eventually get rid of it and let Americans donate to foreign countries if they so choose. It was voluntary, not compulsory. I would support that. But with entitlement reform, you can't balance the budget on the backs of entitlement reform. You can't do it solely on the defense budget either. You can't ride that back either. So it has, and those, and Social Security, Medicare, those four are the big hitters in our budget. But it needs to be looked at. You do have to go and you have to cut somewhere. Here's another idea. I was reading this and I thought, and I know it's not a new idea, but the federal government needs to consider liquidating a lot of their assets. We have over 700-something thousand buildings, complexes. We have a tremendous amount of land. Now, if you dumped all that real estate at once on the market, you would kill the real estate, commercial real estate market. But a phased-in approach where we sell governmental assets to Americans only. No one from a foreign nation outside of where their embassy is located should own American property. That's my particular view on that. But those are just some of the ideas. So reform the committees, look at that, shrinking the committees that have budgetary responsibility, entitlement reform, which nobody wants to talk about, look at selling federal assets and perhaps just contributing that specifically to the debt and the deficit, and then bring our boys and girls home. And those items right there will get us a long way. And maybe a balanced budget wouldn't be necessary, but if it still is, then let's have a constitutional convention and let's get it done.
Yes. Speaking about the rank and file Americans are working on Main Street USA, and people have reacted recently to some of these decisions that President Trump has gone in the public as far as importing our steel and the tariffs. But I want to talk to you about creating jobs through having an equal playing field and, making our taxes on those businesses at the optimal level to where they can, American businesses can return home and reemploy, where it's advantageous to them, American workers. That's really what makes the most sense, not for, the elite that are paying for a ton of these big campaigns, but, those, right in the middle of America, these flyover states that, are often unheard, but these are the ones that need, manufacturing jobs, and they need those businesses to return to America. And how do you propose, through similar things that like the president's been doing, but what would you support as far as lowering corporate taxes and imposing tariffs globally to where there's an equal playing field so that American businesses can return the American workers to work?
Regarding the president's recent proposal about the tariffs, I don't support them. I'm a free trader. I don't believe that you need huge trade bills to have free trade. It's a single piece of paper. Now, the caveat of that is many of the countries that we do trade with, they subsidize those businesses, and their labor is much cheaper. So I understand the sentiment, and I understand what he's trying to do, and it could also be a negotiating tactic. Now, if the other countries think that, they won't work, but that could be a negotiating tactic. I don't support tariffs. The only way I would support tariffs if we had absolutely no income tax and no any other tax we pay to the government. Our country used to receive, the government used to receive revenue, for many years on tariffs. We didn't have a national income tax. So I do believe that the literature kind of bears this out, that a tariff is essentially acting like a tax on purchasers, because it hurts. You may be trying to help, the steel and aluminum industry as far as production, but those down the supply chain get hurt. And how's that going to affect our ability to sell things overseas? Is there going to be a full-blown out trade war? I don't know. Could there be? Yeah, but it could also be a negotiating tactic. The president, he likes to ask for more than what he actually wants, and I can see that as a strategy. The tariffs in general, I don't support that, but I understand the sentiment behind it and the goal that he thinks, that it will help out American businesses. Because he's right about steel and aluminum. That's a national defense issue. It really is, because he talks about, we need those things for the military, and it is a national. If we had no steel production in this country, and we couldn't support our defense, if we were going to war with, some foreign invader, or they suddenly decided to stop selling us steel and aluminum, and they got a conglomerate around the world, you said that probably won't happen, but it's possible, then we would have no steel production. Our steel production, that's when after the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, America got to work. You see the women with the sleeves rolled up, and the men went to fight, and the women went into the factories, and they built ships and steel and planes. So it is a national defense issue. I don't agree with the tariffs, and I think, that's somewhere we should tread lightly, because I am a free trader. But I also think it should be fair. If we have a free trade agreement with a country on a particular segment, like agriculture or whatever it is, then it needs to be free. You're not subsidizing your product that comes over here. We can learn to deal with wages because you got to pay the cost to come overseas, but also cutting corporate tax rates. We cut those a lot, and a lot of that money is being repatriated, and it's great. And you hear on the news about the companies that have given their employees bonuses or given them raises, or they're making other investments, and that's great. And that's going to have ramifications down the road that I think are going to be positive. But maybe you need to look at it even bringing those lower in the future. Of course, you got to worry about the spending side too. Bringing those down in the future so we can be more competitive. Because the taxes that corporations pay is accounted for or is taken into account when they're looking to invest or expand. It is a form of cost.
Yes. And one last thing is, when we grew up, there were differences in opinions, and some people get into arguments, obviously, and that's happened throughout, the entire history of mankind. But, we, back in the day, we used to see, that we shared more in common as Americans, whether those were, what, our Constitution provides, that we have, those freedoms, which we all agree on, the right to have free speech, to vote, to worship, and to assemble. And we saw ourselves united amongst those beliefs. Now, it's been kind of vogue, to divide ourselves into, and Teddy Roosevelt and many other people throughout history talked about this, hyphenating, your category, that you're not just an American. Some people think that they're not American at all. They'd rather identify, their country of origin. But what do you see is, the effective way that is, member of Congress, you and your colleagues, if you win the nomination and you win your seat in Congress, hopefully you will, that we can bring America back together where we converge again and agree upon those things that we share in common versus fighting so bitterly on what we are different about.
One of the things that really divides us along party lines and Americans is what the role of government is. And that's something that everything you're talking about can be sort of seen as trickled down, because oftentimes people are looking for someone else to help or do something for them. And the great thing about our Constitution is, our religious freedoms, freedom of speech, and those things. But when you stop believing that, then you're going to start trying to have policies or laws enforceable by government that tries to mandate behavior. So this is something I think about a lot. Like, the sympathies towards socialism in our country is a huge problem. And the compulsory nature of socialism, first of all, it doesn't work economically. The compulsory nature of it is anti-liberty, and I could never go along with it. But here's the thing about those people who want more control and more socialized living spaces, if you will. In America, here's the great thing. Nothing is stopping you from getting a group of people who are like-minded, buying homes in a neighborhood, and sharing everything among yourselves if that's what you want to do. You guys can have universal health care all together. And those of us that don't want that, we're out here, paying our private insurance or whatever. So there's a voluntary aspect to our country, and you can go out and you can experiment with those things. And more power to you. There's already groups of people who do that in this country. But to try to compel everyone else to live like you do, or to saying it's better, that doesn't work here. It won't work, and we're kind of tired. That's one of the things that splits us. It's actually, to borrow a phrase from the 90s, balkanizing us. The hyphenization of our, I'm this American, or I'm European American, I'm Irish American, whatever. That doesn't unite us, and the Bill of Rights does. Now, also what unites many of us, at least we pretend it does, and that's religion. I believe it's upwards of 80-something% identify as Christians in this country. If that's the case, then let's live it. And it's easy to say that, and sometimes you think it's hard to do. But if you start there, with, Sermon on the Mount, so to speak, and, you love your neighbor, if you start there, it's not contentious right off the bat. Because there are things, we're not going to agree with everything. I was at a town hall last night, and gun control was brought up, and I didn't tell them who I was. I was just a participant, just kind of watching and listening to the people. It kind of became contentious, and then I realized that people stopped listening to each other. And that's something that we really have to get past. God gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth, right? Listen twice as much as you speak, hopefully. But, and that's something I have to remind myself too, is to listen first and listen to what they're saying and try to put myself in their shoes. But will that work in Congress? It gets back to the gridlock and bipartisan. But if you don't have respect for someone else and what they've been through, then it's almost a non-starter. And we have to be willing to try to get back to that and have goodwill. I know that sounds like, rainbows and unicorns, but it has to start somewhere. And oftentimes, we have to be the ambassadors. Like, if I see, I'm one of these people, if I see fights, I'm going to go try to break it up. If I see arguments, I get into it. It's not recommended, but I try to make peace. That's kind of who I am as a person. And that's the approach I would bring. Now, I can also be contentious and argue and fight for something I believe is right, like whether it's regarding our troops or like I gave the example earlier when I was in Afghanistan, and there's other things too in my life where I've had to jump out of my skin, out of my comfort zone to pursue those things. But it's a hard question to give a succinct answer to, but you have to start with conversation and actually, if you're a Christian, then pretend like it, or act like it.
Amen. And again, thank you very much, Barry Bell. It's not only been an honor to serve with you personally in my first infantry unit as a young infantry officer, but to see you develop and mature throughout the rest of your life, serving both in the Army, completing your bachelor's, your master's, serving in the corporate world, over 5.5 years, you've really accomplished a great amount. And I really do appreciate that mindset that you have of selfless service that you've demonstrated both by serving our nation as an enlisted Marine and as a commissioned intelligence officer in the Army, and going out and serving in combat in Afghanistan and taking those characteristic, those leadership traits and seeking to, again, serve the people instead of being served. And I wish you, the best favor and Godspeed in your pursuit to fight and to win in this campaign, just like you did in the military. And hopefully, this November will result in again, another success that I was used to seeing you, achieve victory. This time you won't have the same set of gloves on, but you've thrown your hat in the ring. And answer the 2 final questions is, when is your primary there in the 4th District of South Carolina? When does that vote date start? And then how can people get more information to, find out more information about Barry Bell and how to, contribute to your campaign?
Fred, I think I appreciate that very much, and the opportunity to come on the Commando show and make my case, and it's good to see and talk to you again. So, in order to, if you would like to help out, volunteer, or contribute, I can be reached at votebellforcongress.com. Also, I just created a new Twitter handle, and it's called bbell for Congress, the number 4 Congress, or at bbell for Congress, and that's the Twitter handle. Facebook's coming up. I'm trying to get that launched, but you can click right there on the website and contribute. If you'd like to volunteer, or if you'd like to host a house party, if you'd like that small setting, I'd be more than honored to come into your home and speak to you and your fellow citizens there. So I appreciate that opportunity. Quickly, if I could, Fred, for your Commando listeners, quick story about you. And it was a Saturday, we're on Liberty, and we're just kind of smoking and joking around the barracks, and here comes the lieutenant. He's coming up, and he's in PTQ, and we're all like, oh man, what's going on? So he gets me, and he's like, we're going to go for a run. Because I was probably third or fourth fastest in the platoon at the time. I could run under 18. So on the hills of Camp Pendleton, they're pretty brutal. But I wasn't really scared of them. I didn't think, I can run hills. So we get up there and we run these hills. The fire breaks up there. My legs were on fire. I'd done squats the night before. I start puking. And at the time, Lieutenant Galvin's like, oh, come on, Bill. Is that all you got? He was giving me a hard time, and I'm over here yakking. So there's kind of a funny story. I ended up going back to the barracks and needing plenty of water and rest. But he wore me out that day, and I've always remembered that, and it's a fond memory. So I just wanted to kind of quick tell that to your commandos and a little bit about you there.
Well, I appreciate the stories, 20 years old, and I don't know if either of us could run as fast and as far up those fire breaks as we did back then, but I appreciate, just like the theme of the Go Commando show is getting to the naked truth, and I appreciate you providing that little piece of a character. 'Cause back then, I think I was a little bit more of a character, and just coming around the barracks on a Saturday, rousting people out of their rooms and trying to go for a physical training period up some of the mountains had some fond names, and when you're yakking up your breakfast, it's a good gut check, literally. So again, thanks for providing that naked truth. That's what we like to get to at the Go Commando show, is get down to the real unvarnished truth of what it's really all about, and that's hopefully all the listeners that see this and hear this are able to understand the same naked truth about candidate Barry Bell. Is a man that's plain and simple, gives unvarnished truth. He's looking out for the people in his district and their best interests. He's not influenced by big government or big business. He's doing this knowing that as a individual from a small town and from a background that isn't provided the wealth and the backing of all the systems, that he's in for a fight, and he's shown an entire lifetime of not just getting in the ring when we used to mix it up with the gloves in the Marine Infantry. And one of those stories too, I remember we'd fight all across Camp Pendleton, but even when we were on deployment, this was in the days when boxing and the martial or physical sports were not exactly looked at with fondness by certain individuals in the U.S. military leadership. So I remember on the ship when we were sailing over to the Middle East, we would go down into the well deck, and this amphibious ship where the actual small boats and hovercraft would launch out the back and take Marines in our vehicles, personnel and equipment to shore and go fight battles. But one thing about that is we'd go down there in often really odd hours before anybody else on the ship was awake. We'd go down there to fight, and I remember many times because Barry Bell had a background in fighting, and he'd really put it to some of the guys. I also remember times, and I'll wrap it up with this, is he looked out for those that they couldn't also look out for themselves. There was another Marine in our same platoon with the last name of Bell, and he hung together with other people in the platoon that didn't always have the same kind of confidence, skills, tenacity, streetwise, and he was their protector. And the good thing about candidate Barry Bell is I vouch that he's going to be doing that the same. That we talked about, it's been 20 years since we ran that big gut check race, and reconnecting with him, he has not changed. He's not contributing anything to me. I mean, this show is completely uninfluenced. I just wish him the very best of luck, and I give him my wholehearted endorsement, not just to fight with everything he has, which I know he will, but for you listeners to share with those in the 4th District of South Carolina that coming up on this primary, and hopefully, God willing, he makes it to win the Republican nomination and goes on to go to the November election that he wins and becomes this member of Congress. So again, Barry Bell, I wish you the very best of luck. It's an honor to have you on the show, to speak with you, and to give you some encouragement and to fight with everything you have. It's going to be a tough road that's going to go by really quick. It may not seem quick, but it'll be done before you know it. And I know you'll give it your all. And I'll tell you what, there's a lot of opponents and adversaries that are going to pull out all the stops. And so I know you got the brains and the tenacity to fight and to win and be effective. So again, thanks for being on the show, and God bless, Godspeed, and wish you the best of luck. And hopefully I'll see you in Congress in 2019 after you win here in 2018.
All right, thank you. I appreciate it very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
To all my fellow grunts out there who in your youth felt it was your duty to protect us, I salute you. And thanks to the listeners of the Go Commando Show who labor on the farm, who are sweating on the construction site, putting forth your very best at the office. You are making a difference. Support the Go Commando Show in our pursuit of bringing you the highest quality professionals. Infiltrate the website at gocommandoshow.com, where you can view all of the podcasts and arm your team with incredible deals on health supplements, commando clothing, and equipment. Every time that you get a good deal, it supports the show. What deals? When you purchase anything from the website, Amazon, healthcare supplements, you're covering our six. And to the ladies on the team, when you outfit yourself in the super sexy threads from Naked Zebra, and yes, I'm talking about in fuego, you are firing the sniper shot for our commandos. How else can you support? It's simple. You smash the follow and subscribe buttons on our social media. That is how you support us bringing great guests to talk about serious subjects, not the mainstream media's fake news. So thank you, and until our next show, stay in the attack and go Commando.